Welcome to Fox Valley Today. I'm your host, Ann Vickery. Joining me today as my guest is Alex Edwards, who is the author of a book called Four Failures Who Changed the World. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for having me.
Well, I don't think you're not actually new to being on our radio and our TV station through the years. You've kind of got a history here because you're kind of a local guy, right?
That's right. I'm in Sandwich. I've been here for, next year will be 13 years. And I've been lucky enough to appear on WSPY radio a few times, and I was on the library board at one time and was here on the television. So it was great to be back.
Well, then you're well known in the studio. I know that
Exactly,
because everybody
right.
knows who Alex is. That's for sure. You know, I was kind of intrigued, when we were talking a little bit about having you back on the show, because I wasn't around or was not here during the, especially when you had an interview with Chris. But when the book title really intrigued me, because Four Failures Who Changed the World is kind of a catchy little thing and makes you kind of wonder, what the heck is he talking about? So why don't you kind of lay out the basis of what made you want to write a book like that?
Sure.
And who it's about.
Yeah, well, the book is basically kind of an inspirational / history book. I wrote about four very iconic American figures: Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Abraham Lincoln, and believe it or not, Colonel Harlan Sanders from Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Oh, KFC, yeah.
That's right, KFC. A lot of people ask me, how could you put Colonel Sanders in with Edison, Ford, and Lincoln? And the reason I put him, not for a little entertainment factor, because he was 65 years old when Kentucky Fried Chicken finally took off. So one of the main points of having him in there is that one of his great quotes was, "Don't stop at 65 because your boat maybe hasn't come in yet."
You just never know.
Exactly.
That's true. Now, so you had to pick four people. You picked Henry Ford, Abraham Lincoln, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and Colonel Sanders.
Right.
So why those four particular ones?
Well, I guess those four particular people were interesting to me. I'm a big history guy. I'm a big car guy. So Henry Ford is a great hero of mine. And I always, when I go to Springfield, I always go to Lincoln's house, to the tomb, just fascinated by the life of Abraham Lincoln and what he means to this country, what he did during the Civil War, etc. But those people were so iconic and did such incredible things in life that influenced this country to this day.
Right.
I felt as though a lot of people didn't know the backstory, as Paul Harvey used to talk about the rest of the story, that each of these men actually had a lot of adversity and a good amount of failure in their lives before they finally made this great iconic success of themselves.
Tell me a little bit about Henry Ford.
Sure.
What it was that you said. We all know what he did in the end.
Right.
But tell us a little bit about his failures.
Right. Well, Henry Ford grew up as a son of a farmer. A lot of people think that Henry Ford just walked out into the field one day and started the Ford Motor Company, and that was the end of it. A lot of people don't know that his first two companies that he was involved with actually did fail. One was eventually became the Cadillac Motor Car Company. He really wanted to build a car his whole time being in that business for the masses, a good car, a less expensive car. His investors at that time didn't want to do that. They wanted to focus on luxury cars. He didn't think that was a great idea. So his first two companies failed. And then when the Ford Motor Company started in 1903, they had some success. They sold cars. But the Model T, which is the most successful outside of the VW Beetle, probably the most successful car ever made, they made 15 million of those cars between 1908 and 1927.
Think about that.
Think about that. It's a mind blower when you really think about it.
Yeah, when you think the population of this country during that time was probably only 50 million.
Exactly. In the 1920s, 50% of the cars on the road were Fords. So how would you like to have that market share today?
Boy, that'd be good.
But even with the Model T, it took the Ford Motor Company 5 years to even come up with the car that would eventually become the Model T. So this was not a just instant success. I tell people about Ford's first car, what was called the quadricycle, which basically was a little buggy with 4 bicycle wheels on it. He built it in a garage behind his house. Once it was built, he couldn't get it through the door. He had to knock down a brick wall to get the thing out. It had no brakes, it had no reverse. It broke down on his inaugural trip around the block.
Right.
And nothing really happened for several years after that, even though that was one of the first automobiles ever made. So, the point of the book, Ann, is to really help people understand and really know, because life plays no favorites. That's kind of the theme of the book. These people, Lincoln, Edison, Ford, didn't have some magic dust on them or some cosmic influence on them that's any different from anyone else. It took
Right.
them a long time to get things done. We're no different.
Right.
And that was really the point of the book.
In other words, they didn't get it the easy way. They didn't inherit it.
Exactly.
And coming from a farm, he saw the hard work that it took, the manual labor.
Right.
And even after they came out with what they called the horseless carriage,
Mm-hmm.
right? People laughed at it. They didn't think
Yes.
the horses would ever go away.
Thought it was a fad.
Yeah.
Thought it was ridiculous.
And
yeah.
really, and today those, a few of the people that I know still own a Model T.
As a matter of fact,
having them restored.
I owned a Model T at one time.
Really?
And I hope to buy another one. So yeah,
Yeah.
they're a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sure that they are. So now, Abraham Lincoln, everybody kind of knows the story. I mean, you'd have to be somewhere from Mars
Right.
if you didn't know the story of Abraham Lincoln. But we all think about the Civil War. We all think about the abolishing the slavery. We all think about the assassination. But before that, adversity
Right.
for him came as a very, very young child.
It sure did. Well, he grew up in a one-room cabin, basically, that was not much larger than this set here, with a full family. Very poor
in
family.
Kentucky.
In Kentucky, very poor family. As we were discussing before, his mother died when he was very young. He was just so fond of his mother. She was everything to him.
She taught him she started him reading.
Exactly. He had very little, if no formal education. So his mother died when he was very young, as I say. Abraham Lincoln had a tremendous amount of failure in his life before he became the President of the United States. There's a town that has been reconstructed outside of Springfield called New Salem, Illinois, which is a great thing. If anyone's never been there, I'd suggest it. He went into business in New Salem. He failed at that. His partner passed away, and he was left with the debts of his partner. Before Mary Todd Lincoln, he was involved with a lady. He was engaged to a lady named Anne Rutledge.
Right.
She died. He went into a Great Depression about that. Even politically, he had run for Congress at one time, lost that, ran for Senate 2 times, lost that. He was trying to get nominated for the presidency the vice presidency in 1858. He lost that one. And then, of course, in 1860, he was elected to the presidency. 2 of his sons died in his lifetime. Mm-hmm. So, most people who would have this kind of failure and tragedy would just go to bed and just never get out.
And they talked, there's a lot, if you read a lot of the Lincoln books, they talked about how he would go into this very deep depression.
Yes.
And he described it as a overwhelming darkness.
A melancholy.
Yeah. And that's what they called it, melancholy.
Yeah.
And then remarried, Mary Todd, which was not an easy marriage.
No, it wasn't. She was a tricky customer. She was a very, confident, headstrong, opinionated woman.
Who came from a family with some money.
Yes, they did. And ironically, she came from a family that owned slaves. So
Yeah.
a lot of people don't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of dichotomy there. But totally different backgrounds. Abraham Lincoln was poor. He was uneducated. Mary Todd was from a very prosperous family, very, kind of ritzy, affluent, a lot of nice things. So it's amazing that they even got together.
Right.
When you think about it. But she was really the wing, the air underneath her wings, as they say. Or the
Yeah,
wind
she was
under
kind
her
of his
wings.
wingman, right?
Exactly.
Right? She really was.
She pushed him.
She was bright.
Absolutely.
And with all her probably mental illness or her as you used the word, she was kind of addled,
Right.
a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was interesting about the Lincolns, as you've read through it, they were not good with money. She spent it and he didn't understand it.
Right.
And I think that, her coming from a family that was pretty well off and him coming from a family who had nothing, he had no, what you might call, economic background
Right.
of how to even handle money.
How to handle it, because he never had it.
He never had it, right?
And yet the great thing about him is that he became a successful lawyer. And then even then having failure after that, but he would ride the circuit through Illinois, on his horse
Right.
and be a lawyer. I've been to his house many times, and a lot of people don't know that his house originally was a one-story house, and he had it built up to 2 stories. He paid $1,500 for that house, and I think in about 1841, which was just an amazing amount of money back then. So he really had risen from the ashes, from nothing to being able to have this house. So.
Yeah,
But
and yet the house is so tiny.
It's
You wonder,
not
you wonder
large.
how did a guy like that, and they always talk about in the books about, of course, people were smaller, and here was a guy that was what, 6'4"?
He was 6'4", yeah.
And every place he went in, and then with this big stovepipe hat, he was probably about 6'8".
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
right. You could play basketball with that hat
right.
on. You know?
He'd had a career in something.
No,
Yeah.
it's very true. It's very true. And that's, as we talked earlier, one of the things, they used to make fun of Abraham Lincoln because he was physically kind of a gawky looking guy.
He was.
Very tall for his time. They'd say that you always see Abe Lincoln coming down the street because he was, so much taller than everybody else,
Right.
especially with his hat, stovetop pipe hat that you mentioned.
We were also talking about the fact that we were talking about the fact that there was a book out called The Last Lincolns, and that the last Lincoln actually died off. When did you say?
1985, I believe, the last direct descendant of Abraham Lincoln passed away. I want to say that was Robert Todd Lincoln's children, if I'm not mistaken. But because he had 4 sons, the other 3 died. The first 2 died very young. One of them died in the White House, Willie, in 1862. But Robert Todd Lincoln was the only son that grew to maturity.
Right. And was quite a successful businessman.
Yes, he
himself.
was. He was very successful in his own right. Yeah,
he was.
Exactly.
But he had his mother locked into a mental institution.
He did, in Batavia, believe it or not. Yeah. And
she did.
today, probably, there'd be medication and things like that for people who had ailments like she had, but back then they didn't understand it.
No, and do you realize that she was the first widow of a president to receive a pension?
I remember reading that now that you mentioned that, yeah.
So maybe we could elaborate on the next little book.
Yeah, right, I'll start that book, yeah. The President's Wives and Their Pensions.
Right, and their pensions.
Right, exactly.
Because there's, when you think about women today, there's, a lot of women don't even have a pension still. But anyway, you went through Abe Lincoln, but then we get down to Thomas Edison, and
Yes.
you say we'd probably still all be sitting here in the dark.
That's right. We couldn't do this show if it wasn't for Tom Edison.
Right.
Well, the thing about Tom Edison is everyone knows that he's most famous for inventing the light bulb. He had over 1,000 patents in his life. He also invented such things as a motion picture camera, things of that nature. But a lot of people don't know that when he invented the incandescent light bulb, as it's called, the little wire, the filament that lights up that makes the light.
Right.
He tried. Now I've heard different numbers, 700, 1,000 times, but he tried nearly 1,000 times to find a filament that would light up and then stay glowing and not blow up in the vacuum of the light bulb.
Was he one of those guys that used radium?
I don't know if he used radium, but he just couldn't find the cotton thread, wool, whatever he was using as the wire, that it wouldn't blow within an hour or 2 hours or whatever. And finally, he found the correct, concentration of the material to make the filament. So his famous quote was, "I didn't fail, I just found 1,000 ways that didn't work," kind of thing. But if you think about that persistence, Ann, most people would have said, after 20 times, well, obviously this is not to be. This is not going to happen.
Yeah.
And he obviously changed the world, But he had a lot of failure. He went to school. He was in a one-room schoolhouse. His teacher, Tom Edison drove him crazy because he would ask why all the time, why this, why that. Because you'd think a Tom Edison would ask questions like that. His teacher pulled his mother aside and look, he's obviously mentally impaired. They called him addled at that time. That was a word they used back then. And he left school, and his mother taught him Shakespeare and about science and astronomy and mathematics. So he had very little formal schooling, which is amazing. Another thing, a lot of people don't realize that for a good part of his life, he was profoundly deaf.
So when you say a good part of his life, he was profoundly deaf. When you think back in the early late 1800s, early 1900s, how did they change that for him?
Well, they really didn't, I don't think.
Because they used to use a megaphone to talk into the ear.
Yeah, it was called an ear trumpet. Yeah.
Right.
Well, they didn't have, to my knowledge, hearing aids like they have today. There's famous footage. He and Henry Ford became very good friends, actually. Henry Ford worked for the Edison Illuminating Company early in his career, and then when Ford became very prominent. He and Thomas Edison actually became very close friends. Excuse me, but there's footage of Henry Ford. Now this is probably in the 20s. Edison was quite old then. But there's footage of Henry Ford literally an inch from Edison's ear yelling into his ear so he could hear what he's saying. So I don't think they had really too many solutions for him.
Right.
So I think he spent a lot of his time, you know, in deafness.
But you know, I think there is some truth to the fact that people who are born with incredible disabilities at that time, to be deaf at that time or to be blind, find a way to compensate
Yes.
for that in another way.
They overcome
Some other level of their seventh senses really
strengthens.
strengthen.
Well, of course, look at Helen Keller and
Right.
people like that.
Yeah.
It's, the fortitude of people like that is really unbelievable.
And then you put in a real odd mix of Colonel Sanders.
Yeah, a lot of people say, you know, you must like fried chicken, you know, for you to, and I certainly do, but I put Colonel Sanders in there, not for comedic purposes, but just a little lightheartedness. But primarily I put Colonel Sanders in there because a lot of people don't know, you know, everyone sees Colonel Sanders as the grandfatherly, loving guy that the children ran to, and that was very much part of him later in life. But most of his life, he was actually a very cantankerous, very unpleasant guy to be around.
Right.
He ran cafeterias and gas stations and restaurants all through his career. Famous story, he ran a gas station and his district manager was visiting. There was a competing gas station that was repainting over his signs. So they went over and a shootout began, not Colonel Sanders shooting, but two other guys were shooting at guns at each other. One guy wound up dying from it. It was unbelievable. So he had a very cantankerous past.
Right.
He wound up retiring. He was born in 1890, so when he was about in his late 50s, early 60s, he retired. He was getting $105 a month in Social Security.
Oh my.
He was broke, but he always had this secret recipe of 11 herbs and spices for fried chicken. What he was trying to do was go to restaurants and you know, he would cook. Every time he went to a restaurant, he'd have to cook this whole elaborate thing. So it was a very, you know, complicated demonstration every time. So he wanted a few cents per piece of chicken for these restaurants. So he got in his car, and he was wearing his white suit, you know, by that time.
Right.
He got in his car for several months, lived in his car, and literally went to hundreds of restaurants all over the country and was rejected time and time again. And at the age of 65, Kentucky Fried Chicken finally took off.
Somebody backed him.
Somebody backed him, and of course, how many people today have eaten Kentucky Fried Chicken?
And it's all over the world.
It's all over the world. And it's darn good, too.
Yeah, it is.
But so one quote I was mentioning to you earlier is that Colonel Sanders said, don't quit at 65 because you never know when your ship will come in.
Yeah, right. You know, there's a card that I oftentimes send to people, and it's called Don't Quit. And it's, you know, when things go bad, and as they sometimes will, when the road you're traveling seems all uphill, and it goes on to say, but don't quit.
Exactly.
And you know what? And actually, I had it made into a needlepoint thing, and I keep it in my house.
Very nice.
Because believe me, there have been many times I've wanted to quit too.
Yes.
Or kill somebody. It's been
Exactly.
a kind of a toss-up. But anyway.
Well, that's the thing, and I've had adversity in my life like everybody. You know, it's very hard when you're in the middle of it to really, as they say, get up one more time than you've been knocked down.
Right.
It's very difficult. It's easy to talk about. It's easy to throw out inspirational quotes, like I like to do. But it's very difficult. But if you can just get that strength somehow inside to believe that you're really no different from anyone else, and you really can do it if you just keep trying at it, is really important, I think.
Well, and you know, it's not only the fact that you maybe have a good idea, but it's that drive, it's that ambition, and it's not really a fear of failure as much as it's a fear of losing your desire, losing the drive.
Right.
You know, I'm always afraid of losing the drive.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
or maybe getting lost in the drive. I don't
You're
know.
going strong, Ann. I don't think we need to worry about that. You're
Anyway,
doing fine.
we have to take a break because if we don't, they'll turn off the whole station.
Right,
because
we don't want that.
Because nobody's going to pay for this.
Exactly.
Okay, we'll be right back in a minute with Alex Edwards, and we'll talk a little bit more about 4 failures who changed the world. And maybe you know one. We'll be right back.
So, I just moved in with this family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that! That's disgusting! Oh, poop already! You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
Maybe I have with that?
Oh, thank you. Did you see anyone's broccoli? Thanks for helping us.
No problem.
These strawberries? You're welcome.
We'd do anything for kids. Yet 1 in 6 children in the U.S. struggle with hunger. Help end childhood hunger near you. Learn how at feedingamerica.org.
Your son wants to get a cat,
I'll really take care of it.
but you're allergic. Do you A, prepare yourself, B, make the best of it,
C squared equals
25.
or C, find a loophole? When it comes to parenting, there are no perfect answers, but that's okay, because you don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Teens in foster care will love you just the same.
Welcome back to Fox Valley Today. I'm here with Alex Edwards, who is the author of the book, 4 Failures Who Changed the World. And we all know about people who, we all know about this, but I want to back up a little bit, and I want to just say this to our listening audience. First of all, this book is you can get this book where?
Yes, it's on Amazon.
Okay.
It's a short read. It's about 80 pages. I made it that way because I didn't want people to have to, like War and Peace, spend 6 months reading it kind of thing. It's $9. I wanted to keep it very reasonable for people. And I wanted a lot of young people to read this book. I think it's important for a lot of high school kids and college kids to read books like this because they really need to understand that life's going to have some knocks, but if you keep going, you're going to be okay.
Well, what I really like about this whole idea too, when you talk about being a short book, the fact that you hit on the fact that young people, but maybe by reading about 1 or 2 of these people, will expand them into wanting to read more about these people.
Yes.
Because there's more to that than just this part of the story.
Yes, spark their interest. My God,
Yeah.
you could spend the rest of your life reading books on Lincoln. I mean,
Yeah, you'd never finish.
400 books have probably been written on it.
Yeah. So your background were you a writer?
Well, I've always seemed to be able to write. I was mentioning to you before my mother, whose name is Corinne Edwards. She actually has written 12 or 15 books. I just seem to, have the ability to do it. And like I said, I've always been interested in history, and I love inspiring, and I love telling stories and things of that nature. So it kind of just became second nature to me. Yeah. And what would you say would be the good age? Who is this book targeted? Is it targeted for just anybody, or is it more to young people? I think from preteen all the way up to 99, I think is the target for this book, because I think it just has a universal message that all of us, including me, by the way, they say sometimes that you teach what you have to learn the most yourself. And I just think it's an important, I didn't invent this message. This, going all the way back to the Bible, they give inspirational themes and beliefs and things like that. But I didn't invent this, but I just thought it would be a good way to continue this message that I think a lot of people need to know about and really apply to their lives and realize that they're no different from anyone else. I told you earlier that the whole book can be kind of summarized by a quote from Henry Ford that he said in the 1920s. that he said people don't fail, they just stop trying. And if you really think about that,
Right.
it really is, if you so-called fail at something, maybe you didn't try just one more time until it happened.
And no one is really, should be, or ever will be, I hope, defined by one failure.
Correct.
You know, and that's hard sometimes to get across to some of our really young kids.
Yes.
Is that, you know, maybe you didn't make the basketball squad, maybe you didn't get to be a pom, maybe you didn't make whatever, maybe you didn't get the A, you got the C. Your life isn't going to end there. It's just the way the day went, and it's how it was. Tomorrow is a new day.
Exactly, and Ann, I talk about that in the book, that we all, you know, human beings, particularly young people, don't have a lot of perspective because they haven't been on this earth very
haven't.
long.
No.
But even those of us who live 80, 90 years, sometimes everything is so this far in our face because we
Right.
are not here too long. We lose that perspective as well.
Right.
And a lot of people feel that if I'm not successful in every darn thing that I do, that I'm a failure. And that's just not realistic or, you know, just something that happens in life. You are not going to be a so-called success at everything
Right.
you do. You know, you're going to have things that don't go well, but you got to keep going on. And if you really look at the body of, you know, your body of work, a lot of people have done great things, even though they've had other problems.
In these four icons that we talked here, Henry Ford, Abe Lincoln, Tom Edison, and Colonel Sanders, besides the fact that they had a lot of failures, what else do you think they had in common?
Well, I mentioned in the book the first thing they had in common is that they never gave up. They were persistent. They had perseverance. And that's tough. Like I said, when you're in the middle of it, when you're feeling down or you're discouraged, that a lot of us, you know, that happens to, when you're in the middle of trying to accomplish something, perseverance is really going to be your best friend, because until you really hang in there, you really don't know if something's going to be a hit or not, whatever it be, like you said, with school or work or an invention or a painting or music or anything like that. One of the things in the book, I have a little fun chapter where I give little quotes of different people, and I mentioned a couple of these to you. There was a guy in Japan after World War II who was desperately trying to get a job with the Toyota Motor Car Company, and he was rejected several times, could not get a job to save his life. His name was Honda. And that's a true story. Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team, went home, went into his room and cried. 26 times when he was going to hit the winning shot in the NBA, he missed to win the game. You know, Chris Schwimline, who's a friend, he's a great baseball guy. We talk about Babe Ruth, 1,300 times he struck out. You know.
That's right.
So these are very important things. There was a music promoter in England who said to a guy, a manager said, send anyone but this one particular group. And by the way, guitar groups are on their way out, and that was a group called the Beatles.
Yeah.
So, you know, people are short-sighted sometimes. People don't, just because the Beatles didn't give up because one music promoter said that you stink
"Get
and
outta
don't,
here,"
get out of here, exactly. And I think that guy Honda turned out pretty good.
I think that he probably did too.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have a terrifically interesting book here. I think especially a good read for our young kids who maybe don't always get a bigger perspective,
Right.
and need that push over the top to say, don't give up.
Right, and
You
we
know-
adults need that too, because we
Right.
get frustrated and want to
We're-
give up.
We're not all going to become as famous as some of these folks here, but you know what? You can be a success in life without ever inventing something wonderful.
That's right. That's
know.
right. Success is how you define it.
That's right.
And this is a good book, I think, for everyone of any age. I think
Okay.
they'd enjoy it. So.
4 Failures Who Changed the World by Alex Edwards. Go to Amazon, buy it for your kids, buy it for your grandma. Everybody will love it. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Alex.
Thank you, Ann.
We'll see you next time.